her clearly, and sometimes in the middle of the game, he would sigh and he'd go off and play by himself behind the car house. When it was like that, I knew it was better than the bottle. When I was almost 6, Jem was near me. Don't have any picture shows here except Jesus ones in the warehouse sometimes, said Jem. Ever seen anything good? Good hat. I was about to say that. He was a year my senior, but I towered over him. And as he told us the old tale, his blue eyes brightened, darkened, and his laugh was suddenly happy. He habitually pulled at a towel to the center of his forehead. The deal was reduced to Dracula to Joe, and Jem said to Phil so I asked Bill where his father was. He ain't said anything about him. I haven't got one. Is he dead? No. Then if he's not dead, they got one, haven't they? Bill laughed. Jem told me to hush, a sure sign that Bill had been studied and found acceptable. Thereafter, the summer passed in a good school. The two would come in and kids on school night, the rest of the kids playing secondary kids in the backyard, busting and running through our list of dramas based on the works of Oliver Austin, Mr. Appleton, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. In this matter, we were lucky to have Bill. He played the character part formerly thrust upon me. Agent Tarzan, Mr. Crabtree and the Rover Boys, Mr. Damon and Tom Swift. Thus we came to know Dill as a pocket murderer who had teamed with eccentric plans, strange longings, and quaint fancies. But by the end of August, our repertoire was back in this town. Sharp curve beyond our house. Walking south, one faced its porch. The sidewalk turned and ran beside the lot. The house was low. It was once white. The deep front porch of green showed. Long ago, darkness was pale and slate gray walls. Rain-gone shingles roofed over the eaves of the veranda, and oak trees sang. The remains of a picket drunkenly gardened front gate and a swept yard that was never swept, where Johnson grass and rabbit tobacco grew in abundance. Inside the house lived a malevolent phantom. People said he existed, but Jem and I had never seen him. People said he went out at night when the moon was down and peeped in windows. When people's azaleas froze in a cold snap, it was because he had breathed on them. Any stealthy small crimes committed in Maycomb was his work. Once the town was terrorized by a series of morbid nocturnal events. People's chickens and household pets were found mutilated. Although the culprit was Crazy Addie, who eventually drowned himself in Barker's Eddy, people still looked at the Radley place unwilling to discard their initial suspicions. A Negro would pass the Radley place at night. He would cut across the sidewalk opposite and whistle while he walked. The Maycomb school grounds adjoined the back of the Radley lot. From the Radley chicken yard, tall pecan trees shook their fruit into the schoolyard. And so the only way to get ventilation into your house and not let every bug in Alabama in is to have screen doors so that you could have air flowing through the house. So they didn't have any screens. That means their house was locked up tight no matter how hot it was. I asked Atticus if they'd ever had any, and Atticus said yes, but before I was born. According to neighborhood legend, when the younger Radley boy was in his teens, he became acquainted with some of the Cunninghams from Old Sarum, an enormous and confusing tribe domiciled in the northern part of the county, and they formed the nearest thing to a gang ever seen in Maycomb. They did little, but enough to be discussed by the town and publicly warned from 3 pulpits. And this is the problem. This is what they did to make them so terrible. They hung around barbershops. They rode the bus to Abbotsville on Sundays and went to the picture show. They attended dances at the county's Riverside Gambling Hell, the Dewdrop Inn and Fishing Camp. They experimented with stump hole whiskey. Nobody in Maycomb had the nerve to tell Mr. Radley that his boy was in the wrong crowd. One night, in an excessive spurt of high spirits, the boys backed around the square in a borrowed flivver, that's a car, resisted arrest by Maycomb's ancient beadle, Mr. Connor, and locked him in the courthouse outhouse. The town decided something needed to be done. Mr. Connor said he knew who each and every one of them was, and he was bound and determined that they wouldn't get away with it. So the boys came before the probate judge on charges of disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, assault, Mr. Radley conceded, but insisted that Boo not be charged with anything. He was not a criminal. The sheriff hadn't the heart to put him in jail alongside Negroes, so Boo was locked in the courthouse basement. Boo's transition from the basement to the back home was nebulous in Jem's memory. Miss Stephanie Crawford said some of the town council told Mr. Radley that if he didn't take Boo back, Boo would die of mold from the damp. Besides, Boo could not live forever on the bounty of the county. Nobody knew what form of intimidation Mr. Radley employed to keep Boo out of sight, but Jem figured that Mr. Radley kept him chained to the bed most of the time. Atticus said no, it wasn't that sort of thing, that there are other ways of making people into ghosts. My memory came alive to see Mrs. Radley occasionally open the front door, walk to the edge of the porch, and pour water on her cannas. But every day Jem and I would see Mr. Radley walking to and from town. He was a thin, leathery man with colorless eyes, so colorless that they did not reflect light. His cheekbones were sharp, and his mouth was wide, with a thin upper lip and a full lower lip. Miss Stephanie Crawford said he was so upright he took the word of God as his only law, and we believed her because Mr. Radley's posture was ramrod straight. He never spoke to us. When he passed, we would look at the ground and say, "Good morning, sir," and he would cough in reply. Mr. Radley's elder son lived in Pensacola, and when he came home at Christmas, he was one of the few persons we ever saw enter or leave the place. From that day, Mr. Radley took Arthur home. People said the house died. But there came a day when Atticus told us he'd wear us out if we made any noise in the yard, and commissioned Calpurnia to serve in his absence if she heard a sound out of us. Mr. Radley was dying. He took his time about it. Wooden sawhorses blocked the road at each end of the Radley lot. Straw was put down on the sidewalk. Traffic was diverted to the back street. Dr. Reynolds parked his car in front of our house and walked to the Radleys every time he was called. Jem and I crept around the yard for days. At last the sawhorses were taken away, and we stood watching from the front porch when Mr. Radley made his final journey past our house. "There goes the meanest man ever God blew breath into," murmured Calpurnia, and she spat meditatively into the yard. We looked at her in surprise, for Calpurnia rarely commented on the ways of black people. The neighborhood thought when Mr. Radley went under that Boo would come out. But it had another thing coming. Boo's elder brother returned from Pensacola and took Mr. Radley's place. The only difference between him and his father were their ages. Jem said Mr. Nathan Radley bought cotton too. Mr. Nathan would speak to us, however, when we said good morning, and sometimes we saw him coming from town with a magazine in his hand. The more we told Dill about the Radleys, the more he wanted to know. The longer he would stand hugging the light pole on the corner, the more he would wonder. "Wonder what he does in there," he would murmur. "Look like he just stick his head out of the door." Jem said, "He goes out all right. When it's pitch dark, Miss Stephanie Crawford said she woke up in the middle of the night one time and saw him looking straight through her window, and said his head was like a skull looking at her. Ain't you ever waked up at night and heard him, Dill? He walks like this. Jem slid his feet through the gravel. Why do you think Miss Rachel locks up so tight at night? I've seen his tracks in our backyard many a morning, and one night I heard him scratching on the back screen. But he was gone time Atticus got there. Wonder what he looks like, said Dill. Jem gave a reasonable description of Boo. Boo was about 6.5 feet tall, judging from his tracks. He dined on raw squirrels and cats when he could catch 'em. That's why his hands were blood-stained. If you ate an animal raw, you could never wash the blood off. There was a long, jagged scar that ran across his face. What teeth he had were yellow and rotten. His eyes popped, and he drooled most of the time. Let's try to make him come out, said Dill. I'd like to see what he looks like. Jem said if Dill wanted to get himself killed, all he had to do was go up and knock on the front door. Our first raid came to pass only because Dill bet Jem, the gray ghost against 2 Tom Swifts, that Jem wouldn't get any farther than the Radley gate. In all his life, Jem had never declaimed a dare. Jem thought about it for always running, I said. But Dill got him the 3rd day, when he told Jem the folks in Meridian certainly weren't as afraid as the folks in Maycomb, that he had never seen such scary folks as the ones in Maycomb. This was enough to make Jem march to the corner, where he stepped and leaned against the lap pole, watching the gate hanging crazily on its homemade hinge. I hope you got it through your head that he'll kill us each and every one, Dill Harris, said Jem, when we joined him. Don't blame me when he gouges your eyes out. You started it, remember. You're still scared, murmured Dill patiently. Jem wanted Dill to know once and for all that he wasn't scared of anything. It's just that I can't think of a better way to make him come out without him getting us. Besides, Jem had his little sister to think of. When he said that, I knew he was afraid. Jem had his little sister to think of the time I dared him to jump off the top of his house. If I got killed, what'd become of you, he asked. Then he jumped, landed unhurt, and his sense of responsibility left him until confronted by the Radley place. You gonna run out on a dare? Asked Dill. If you are, then... Dill, you have to think about these things, Jem said. Let me think a minute. It's sort of like making a turtle come out. How's that? Asked Dill. Strike a match under him. I told Jem if he set fire to the Radley house, I was going to tell Atticus on him. Dill said striking a match under a turtle was hateful. Ain't hateful, just persuades him. It's not like you chuck him in the fire, Jem growled. How do you know a match don't hurt him? Turtles can't feel, stupid, said Jem. We're down until we can tell him that we ain't going to hurt him. We left the corner, crossed the side street that ran in front of the Radley place, and stopped at the gate. Sorry. Well, go on, said Dill. Scout me's right behind you. I'm going, said Jem. Don't hurry me. He walked to the corner of the lot and then back again, studying the simple terrain as if deciding how best to effect an entry, frowning and scratching his head. Then I sneered at him. Jem threw open the gate and sped to the side of his house, slapped it with his palm, and ran back past us, not waiting to see if his foray was successful. Dill and I followed on his heels. Safely on our porch, panting and out of breath, we looked back. The old house was the same, droopy and sick, but as we stared down the street, we thought we saw an inside shutter move. Flick. A tiny, almost invisible movement, and the house was still. Dill left us early in September to return to Meridian. We saw him off the 5 o'clock bus, and I was miserable without him, until it occurred to me that I would be starting school in a week. I never looked forward more to anything in my life. Hours of winter time had found me in the treehouse, looking over the schoolyard and spying on multitudes of children through a 2-power telescope Jem had given me, learning their games, following Jem's red jacket through the wriggling circles of Blind Man's Bluff, secretly sharing their misadventures and minor victories. I longed to join them. Jem condescended to take me to school the first day, a job usually done by one's parents. But Atticus had said Jem would be delighted to show me where my room was. I think some money changed hands in this transaction, for as we trotted round the corner past the Radley place, I heard an unfamiliar jingle.